Do you know what Ukraine means? The word.
The word itself?
Yeah.
No.
Do you?
I actually don't know.
It means the borderland. That's why it's called the Ukraine. They dropped the after the Soviet Union's collapse because they didn't want to be referred to Russia's borderland. Russia called it its borderland because it was historically a part of Russia, and Kiev was its capital.
I don't care about 800 years ago. I don't care about 60.
Well, this is pre-Soviet Union.
I don't care about
You
500
don't even
years
care
ago,
about 1992.
So,
I absolutely do.
Well, no, you said like, oh, they just jumped. There's things
Again,
that
if Russia had decided to militarily invade Ukraine in 1992, I would have opposed that. And I oppose it now. And again,
I mean, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, we wouldn't have called it a military invasion of Ukraine because the Soviet states were in chaos and disarray, and they were largely under the rule of Russia as it was.
There was a lot going on, and you're probably correct, actually, in the fact that we probably would have just let it see where the chips fall. But the chips have fallen, and we live in a world where certain borders have been drawn, right? And I think that, again, what is happening today, we're not talking about 20 years ago, we're not talking about ancient history of 800 years ago, is Russia is engaged in an illegal and unjustifiable expansive project where it wants to take parts of Ukraine and absorb it into itself because Putin believes that ethnic Russians, that the Ukraine isn't a thing, that they're all ethnic Russians, and he feels that a greater Russian Empire wants to be a part, like he believes he should expand Russia into this greater empire that they could be a world power again, and he has these imperialist ambitions and dreams, which he has said over and over and over again. So when to the question of the debate, right, of is it in the U.S.'s interest to continue to support Ukraine? Again, yes, it is, because we have financial interests there. We have military interests there, strategic interests there. We are, and making Ukraine an ally in the future, which I think we're on a path to do, and I think that we should do, will give us access to rare earth minerals and better able to, like, defensive bases where we can have better logistics and better protect our interests in these.
Do you know what the principal political conflict in Ukraine was from 2010 to 2014?
The principal political.
The reason
talk about some of the political conflicts. What's the principal one?
Trade. The trade issue.
Oh, trade. Whether we're going to be trading more with the European Union and all that,
or the Russian Federation.
Russians, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're familiar with that conflict?
Vaguely, yes.
I'd assume you'd be more than vaguely, considering it's the reason for the war.
You think that's the reason for the Russian invasion now?
That was the reason for Euromaidan. Yeah,
that's what Putin said. And if we're taking Putin at his word, then
Putin doesn't always tell the truth.
So only when you think he's telling the truth, you'll take what he says.
When I think what he's saying is backed up by his words and deeds, when it makes sense in the when we see him acting. And
what did he say about the trade conflict with Ukraine?
The trade conflict with Ukraine, he obviously wanted people to be able to trade with Russia, and he wanted them to be closer to Russia because, again, he says he wants to absorb Ukraine.
You're wrong.
I'm wrong. What did he say then?
Putin said that he would cut off trade with Ukraine if they entered into an agreement with the EU because he didn't want cheap European products flooding into Russia.
Okay. What does it have to do with whether or not Russia is justified,
the escalation
or whether we have interest in continuing to support Ukraine? I'm just curious.
It was a question about if you understood the political conflict that's occurring in Ukraine and why the war was happening, because you made several assertions about Putin's statements. So I asked you what Putin said, and you didn't know. And then you made an incorrect.
A lot of things, and I'm sure that there are things that I have said that, or that Putin has said that I am unaware of. That's true. Fair enough.
The issue with
he has said some things that I am unaware of, I grant you that.
The trade agreement with Ukraine issue, and largely in the election with Yanukovych and Tymoshenko, had to do with whether or not Ukraine would be opening up to or joining the European Union. Yep. Many of the Western Ukrainians wanted to join the Schengen zone so they can get freedom of movement to leave Ukraine, and they viewed it largely as Poland. They saw it as an opportunity the same as Poland had. When Poland joined the Schengen zone, millions of Poles began to flee the country and go to other countries, notably in the UK, where they started taking jobs with higher base pay because Poland's economy wasn't as good. The EU didn't want to induct Ukraine because their economy was way worse, substantially worse. And the average Ukrainian at the time was making about $400 per month for like your median job. Sure. That meant if they did open the door to trade with Ukraine, 10 million Ukrainians instantly leave Ukraine and go to any other EU country where they can start taking jobs that pay more, which would have caused economic destabilization, not too dissimilar to what they saw with Spain and Greece, which they're trying not to repeat. However, Ukraine was actively in a political dispute. Western powers, notably the U.S., and funding various NGOs through USAID and with European interests, were supporting the EU side of the argument. Russia was supporting the Russian side of the argument, which is why the country was split east to west. The Kiev Oblast obviously was moving to the west, which is why you get Euromaidan. So a lot of NGOs were able to organize with the assistance of USAID. I don't think it's as simple to say that the CIA snapped their fingers and made a revolution happen. They provided the resources so that activists in places like Kiev could do the work without having to worry about having jobs or not getting paid enough money. So largely what ends up happening is Russia issues an ultimatum. Both sides offered tons of money to Yanukovych at the time. Russia said, look, if you open the door to European trade, we're shutting you down. We're not going to do trade with you because cheap European products would then flood into Russia.
Nothing wrong with that.
So Russia has protectionist policies to prevent their economy from being disrupted. So Yanukovych said, okay, let me get back to you. Went to the West and said, Russia's going to cut us off. What do you have to give us instead? When it came down to brass tacks, Russia offered, I think, somewhere around several $1 billion. And Yanukovych was leaning towards taking the deal with the Russian Trade Federation over the EU. This is when the Euromaidan protests ignited, and we got the coup, which led to the physical ousting of Yanukovych. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Yanukovych was a good guy by any means. Timoshenko was also accused of corruption. Ukraine is considered to be one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, especially after
Which
the
is
fall of the Soviet
improving under
Union.
Zelensky, to be clear.
Perhaps. I mean, considering 7 million Ukrainians fled, it's hard to know exactly what's going on. But what we got after the fall of Yanukovych was Poroshenko, which led to, obviously, the Burisma scandal, U.S.'s illicit involvement in Ukraine, the Qatar-Turkey pipeline conflict, Nord Stream 2, the expansion of the war, and ultimately where we're at now with Russia seizing the Donbass region and the oblast stretching from the Donbass down to Crimea to secure a land bridge.
Again, unjustified. What Russia is doing in Ukraine right now, its invasion that it started in February of 2022, is unjustified because it is trying to go in and annex territory. It is trying to seize territory unjustly from a sovereign nation.
Do you
all
think
this,
it was,
all this Euromaidan stuff is a distraction.
It's not
it really is.
Why is it a distraction?
It is a distraction.
Cause of the war is a
because
distraction.
it does not matter to the justification.
The cause doesn't matter?
It does not matter to the justification.
Yeah, the cause, when we're talking about the war in Ukraine, you don't think discussing the cause matters?
I think that the cause being their leader was unconstitutionally ousted does not justify, again, the Bucha massacre. It does not justify the 20,000 children that were snatched away. It does not justify any of these actions that Russia has taken. And Russia has demonstrated again and again and again that this is how it operates. It stirs up this conflict, and then it takes advantage when this conflict happens.
Do you think it was justified for the United States to instruct the state to fire their state prosecutor?
Are we talking about the Burisma scandal and things like that?
I mean, it's connected to it, but the question is, does the U.S. government have the right to go to Ukraine and say, we will withhold congressionally approved loan guarantees unless you fire your state prosecutor?
I don't know enough about that to say, to be clear. And it doesn't matter in the end of the day, because again, we're not talking about U.S. when it comes to, is U.S. justified in, asking Ukraine to fire a prosecutor. We're asking, is the U.S. justified, and should the U.S. continue to aid this current conflict, regardless of how it started?
Is it justified?
We have a situation where Ukraine's people are fighting for its life. They're fighting for its independence. They're fighting for the right to exist as a nation. And I think that we have both financial interest in this, right? In making them allies, in getting mineral trade deals like Trump is trying to do. We have an interest in setting them up and protecting our wider interest in the regions by, again, if we can stop Russia now, because Russia's not going to stop. They have other imperialist ambitions. And again, I encourage you to go watch the April 3rd discussion between the EU commander, Army General Christopher G. Cavoli, and Congress. And he explains this and he sets this out on detail. He shows how, again, Russia, in his professional experience, has 38 years serving in the U.S. Army.
I just,
I'm
going to...
He's a NATO official.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.